Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Scott Chambers, and I'm here, and I have the pleasure to introduce Dr. Samantha Taylor for one of the final events here at Connections 2021 US. Dr. Samantha Taylor is an assistant professor of military and security studies in the Schriever Space Scholars Department of the Department of Space Power at the Air Command and Staff College. Dr. Taylor joined ACSC in 2021 and teaches war theory and joint warfighting. Before coming to ACSC, she started her career in professional military education with a postdoctoral fellowship at the U.S. Naval War College, where she taught theater national security decision-making in 2017. In 2018, she left the U.S. Naval War College and taught as a visiting professor at the U.S. Army War College in the Department of National Security and Strategy, where she taught theories of war, international relations, and national security strategy and policymaking. We were talking before the show, and she said her nickname for all of this, and really hitting the joint card is Dr. Purple Unicorn. Her PhD is in U.S. diplomatic and military history with an emphasis on the Cold War to 1998 from the University of Southern Mississippi. Along with U.S. diplomatic and military history, Dr. Taylor studies European military and diplomatic history, World War I, World War II, U.S. national security strategy and policymaking, cultural history, international relations, and mass communications. As really befitting the theme of this Connections, I'm pleased to welcome her to Outbrief, the working group for brief on gaming to build ethical leaders. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Taylor and say thank you for all your work on the working group.
Thank you, Scott, for that introduction. And I hope that everybody here has enjoyed Connections so far. And so going into Connections focus for this year, ethics and wargaming, the working group for focus for gaming to build ethical leaders. This was probably not like the other working groups. I know from what I understand during our meetings, most of them did papers. This working group, we did not have any papers brought in. Instead, for this working group, this was a more traditional working group, whereas in the group and those that were interested in this discussion met during the working group time during Connections 2021. And the part of this discussion group was to try to discuss and possibly answer 4 questions that were related to how do you possibly help build and train and educate leaders that are ethical and do it in a war game. And so when we're thinking about ethics and war games, do we do it? Do we include ethics intentionally? Or are they something that's just thrown in unintentionally? Where does that fit in? And so for that working group, there were 4 questions that were on the agenda. And those 4 questions were, what ethical theories, ideas, or dilemmas should officers experience or respond to during the game? What challenges will emerge or be expected and how to overcome them? What scenarios should be included so that players experience ethical dilemmas and later explain why they made that decision? What scenarios, if any, should not be included? What does ethical wargaming look like during serious wargaming? Who needs to be involved? What are the questions we expect them to ask and ponder before making a decision? How much time will we expect the staff and commander to spend deliberating? And again, the point of these questions is again to better help us understand how war games can and how they should be designed to support training our leaders to be able to think and make decisions ethically. Another point is the idea that ethics is not just jus ad bellum, jus in bellum, jus post bellum. It's not just or unjust war. As we were discussing and was brought out and is really important to remember is that ethical moral decision-making during any within the continuum of conflict, competition, decision-making may have ethical moral decisions that are not just about justice in, after, during war, but also other ethical moral decisions that our officers maybe have to make when they are deployed, responding to conflicts, crises. And also another interesting point is the other thought is that, and this was something that was brought up in the that we discussed as well, is what are the different levels of ethics and morals that players will have to decide and deal with in education and training. And this last one in particular deals with the fact that this is something that occurs to different extents depending on what level our both officers and our enlisted are responding to, that they make those different ethical decisions. And so moving from there, I used Concept Board. Those of you that did the game labs, you're familiar with them. And so for the game labs from the Concept Board, this is the Concept Board for question 1. And these are basically stickies of the big points and thoughts that came out of that question. And so what you can see is that some of them are kind of like, well, yeah, but the other thing is putting them there made us think more deeply about those particular issues. So the idea of having a devil's advocate, if you have players, officers, or enlisted that are unable or unwilling to make a possibly less than least worst ethical decision. And just a note, I say least worst on purpose because this is the other thing about ethics that we also discuss, is the idea that sometimes there is no perfectly good moral, ethical, legal, there is yes and no. But when it comes to those moral, ethical decisions, sometimes you can only make the least worst ethical, moral decision versus the absolute pure best moral, ethical decisions, because there are other things to deal with. And so we discussed the idea of moral versus ethic versus legal, as well as the other thing is also national interests and how these decisions trying to be morally and ethically correct can create issues with how well that decision can go about supporting the national interest, the strategy that you are trying to achieve. So again, and then other interesting ideas, yeah, that something that looks lawful can also, that is lawful, can look bad. The idea that there can be PR responses to an action that then have other second, third, tertiary effects on as they are moving forward. And so how do we have them encounter and deal with these, but also get them to discuss the impacts of these. And so for question 1, we got into some interesting discussions about ethics, morality, the different types of dilemmas that they can be encountered, and the fact that depending on where they are in the chain of command, those ethical dilemmas and issues and ideas will also be different. And that is something else to be taking into account when we are doing these types of war games. And so from there, we go into question 2, scenarios. You know, the first one, I put it in there because, and so there's a question at the end that in some ways feels like a throwaway question, what scenario should not be included, but at the same time, it's something to really think about. Are there scenarios that cannot be included, or do they need to be included in a certain way so that they can actually be war gamed? We discussed the idea that some things you would want to be careful that they are something that you would only let the red team do. Like there are some actions, some scenarios that only the red team can do because their job as red team is to do the amoral, unethical actions that our guys have to respond to. So there are those things, but also understanding that those ideas, those issues still have to be addressed. And how do you help train and educate our players, our officers, to respond and understand those dilemmas and their responses to them? And so ideas that the ethics, these scenarios should be as wide ranging as possible, take them through as many as we can, but also the idea that they should also be, we should also need to try to see if there are ways within the war games to chain link the scenario so that you can see the effect, you can see the second and third tier effects that those decisions have, not just on morale, but also their effects as they implicate to operational and strategic level decision making as things are going on. And so when you're thinking about ethics, how do you engage ethics committee, where and how would we possibly include psychological, sociological help, not just with helping our guys as they're dealing with these things, but also helping us to better make sure that when we include these scenarios, that they are getting at the issues and the topics that we want our players and officers to engage in. And so from there, I hope that I am going to get a whole bunch of questions from you all in the chat, but we'll see. So moving on to question 3. What does ethical decision-making look like during serious wargaming? Who needs to be involved? What are the questions we expect to our players to ask and ponder before they make the decision? How much time would we expect the staff and a commander to have to be able to spend deliberating this? And one of the important things that was presented is timing. The idea that the timing that they would have in an actual real world event is very little. But how do you do that? How do you make sure that they are both responding within that time frame, also dealing with that stress? So we discussed some pretty interesting ways to kind of encourage that stress. Some may or may not work too well in an actual war game, but there were some interesting thoughts about this. But also understanding that when we're trying to understand our players making ethical decisions and what we're hoping to see them making, or how we're hoping to see them understand and respond to those decisions, these interesting understandings that different responsibilities, different positions within the chain of command, different going to go Army here, MOS, those jobs, what they do to how those ethical decisions change. And so we come up with a couple of scenarios. We've got a scenario with JAG dealing with an individual who may have made a bad moral decision. You've got a scenario where you've got a foreign uniformed army who is using a city to defend itself from blue team forces. How do you respond to that? Or the idea of during a crisis, resolving like a humanitarian disaster, when and how do you look at division or core level decisions about providing aid, how much and when to be able to provide that aid, as well as if you're doing that while also making sure that your own men are getting their aid that they themselves need as well. And so, so again, there are a bunch of different interesting ideas and thoughts that came out from these questions. And I'm going to hit question 4, and then I'm going to start answering questions. So, wrong window. So, last question. Do we respond to players that consistently act unethically in serious war games and hold them accountable? And in particular for this one, it was not just doing the unethical action, as in it was maybe a gray, what I would think of as like a gray line unethical decision, versus a player who is using toxic behavior and trying to win at all costs, is not taking a serious understanding or attempting to seriously respond to and understand that those decisions have ethical implications, and how do you respond to those? And one is accountability was one of the bigger things, but also in some ways bringing in those consequences, putting those consequences into the game, into the rules of the game. So if we had one of the scenarios we thought of was if we had a player that was consistently making unethical, immoral, illegal actions, that we would say, depending on those actions, what the legal consequences would be, that if they're in command, they lose command, that they are arrested, and they are no longer able to make command decisions in that game, to hold them accountable, and then to make sure that we do in the postmortem the discussion to make sure that our players and our officers understand that they have to abide by these rules. They have to also embody those standards, because when they fail to do so in the real world, this not only has implications for them in their careers, but it also has implications for US's ability to go about, or any other nation or state, their ability to go about and conduct operations and actions internationally. How do they how their actions affect that state's credibility and respectability in the world. And so bringing those actions and making those consequences, even though they're not, actually being arrested as they would be in the real world, but making them see that those actions have consequences and they must take those consequences into as much as they can. Because again, when we were discussing question 3, the issue is timing. Sometimes there is no time to make that good ethical decision. But again, making them aware that there are consequences of those actions is not just, yes, it's free. This is a free to fail area, but at the same time, making sure our guys know that there are consequences to some of those failures. Again, that if we're trying to teach and train our guys, they have to be able to free to fail, but also be able to understand what is some of the good ways to make sure that our guys can understand these consequences and try not to do them on purpose. And so, again, I thank the group that joined me in the discussion for this working group. And with that, I will open to questions. Is it unethical to role play unethical actions in a war game? I would say that it is not unethical to role play unethical actions in a war game. And the reason I say that is that, especially if we're dealing with conflict or crisis, our officers will encounter actions and events that are both illegal and immoral, unethical, and they will need to be able to experience those situations and then make a decision in how the best way to respond to those situations. And if you're on the red team, having them role play those unethical actions, it helps us in many ways try to avoid mirroring. The idea that we tend to present and design and have our officers think and see understand the events in the enemy side, but when they do so, they are in fact mirroring our own or their own understandings of events, and they're just presenting it from the enemy versus actually truly taking in an understanding of the enemy's worldview perception so that they can go about and do the respond to the actions in ways that need to. The other idea is, if you have these unethical actions being role played in a war game, we know that in war, particularly horrible things happen. Doing this in a war game is a free space that allows our guys to encounter it in a way that they can begin to understand and think about ways that they can respond to it in ways that are more ethical and hopefully legal. And so I would say that it is not unethical to role play unethical actions in a war game. In some ways, I think that it would be unethical to not play unethical actions in a war game, because you're not, as trainers and educators, we're not educating and training our guys to be able to understand the situation that they may be encountering. And so, next question. Do we hold players accountable to unethical actions in a game in the same way we would in real life? So I think it depends on A, the scenario that they're responding to, B, how they made that unethical action, and 3, are they red team or blue team? So there's 3 different levels to that. And so I think the first thing is, if they're red team, you're expecting them to play those unethical actions, and their accountability for those unethical actions will be hopefully within the responses that the blue team gives to them, and stopping their actions and possibly pulling that group out of power. And so I think in that regard, when you have red team playing unethical actions, that would be the response. For blue team doing unethical actions, there I would see that would be getting and including the organization's guidelines, legal accountability actions put into the game, so that if they do it, especially if you have that player that is constantly, trying to win at all costs, doesn't care and is going to do it, making sure that they and the other players can see and understand and know that if you do these actions, there are both career and legal and criminal consequences to doing so. Excuse me. And so holding actors accountable for unethical red teams needs to be included in ways that fit their roles in the game. And also I think it would be good to include ways to also address, if you do have that actor, have it in the facilitating plans, ways to make sure that you can't really arrest the player, during the game, but put it in a way in the game so that they are no longer in command. And so I think that is one of the ways to put that in, you can't do it truly to the level that we would do it in real life, but let them know that these are the consequences if you did this in real life. Next question. I have not yet, but based on what I'm seeing in connections, I would say that there is positive feedback. And the fact that Command and General Staff is hosting this, and this was their topic for this connections, I would say that it's also something that is very important to DoD and other agencies, that making sure that their players, their officers, their employees, when they are using these as training and education, that they do know and can understand and get positive learning for keeping sure that they keep those ethical decisions in mind as much as they can. I think from here, I would like to maybe start doing, if we did another group, maybe do some papers and look at one or two of the bigger ideas that were pulled up in response to these questions, and do some research and write out, and possibly maybe try to design a war game, maybe not the whole thing, but like the scenario and some of the rules to kind of pull these ideas and thoughts and considerations into a war game. So I'm not sure about that, about the debriefed or restrained after being asked to undertake ethical actions. And I think in some ways, for the restrained part, I think it's more of a debriefing, because if they're red team, they are expected to take the unethical actions in regards to the players that they are representing. But I think this also goes to the idea of having the psychologist or the sociological expert around, able to provide feedback to our players and to us as facilitators and instructors on, A, are we getting the effect that we want, but B, are our guys processing it and able to process it well. And so I think that that is probably the better way to try to help the red team as they're doing these actions. Are there any best practices to monitor games for unethical play? I think one of the first things to do is to know the scenarios that may trigger an ethical action. And if you do it intentionally, then you pretty much know which ones are going to pop up in an unethical action, and then make sure that you have the note taker taking note of what they did that was unethical. And if it is severe enough, then in that place, and this may be tied to another question, this is where you have that player pay the consequences of that action, whether it's reprimand, whether it's criminal JAG action. And so I think it's there that if you're doing a good job as facilitators and monitoring and taking notes of the action, then knowing the scenarios that will trigger those unethical plays is one of the best things to know. And B, having the note taker there taking note so that you can discuss them either immediately if necessary or later in the postmortem, so that our players can better understand and begin to think about the ways that they did not uphold those moral and ethical responsibilities. Next question. I think for this one, it would, for do you want players ahead of time that there will be consequences for unethical action, or that it is assumed? I think it would depend on the war game that you're playing. So if the war game is one that is more combat related, I would think that in some ways we could assume that they would know that if they do unethical action, that they should know that there will be consequences for it. But I think the other thing is also if it's programmed into the design of the war game to have those effects, those consequences in the scenario as it goes forward. And so we were discussing this idea of having chaining the scenarios so that the consequences of an unethical decision, whether it's truly horrible, unethical, or more like blurs the line, having that in the scenario so that they can then understand the consequences to that action. And so I think that is part of, in particular with this one, the consequences of the unethical action is when you make this game, how do you include those consequences, whether it's criminal or if it's just bad PR? Like, how do you let our players know that there are those consequences and making sure that they are built into the game? And so I think that's part of it. So I think the consequences either A, need to be built in and built in well, or B, you just, they're included as part of the post-mortem. So I think for that one, the consequences have to be how you do those consequences have to be part of how you design that game and how you want that game to, if it's going to be pushing those unethical dilemma boundaries, how do you make those consequences something that our players can understand? Hopefully I've answered people's questions. And if not, please put more thoughts, questions into the Discord. And if you pop up and have any thoughts or suggestions, and maybe you want to jump in on a research paper, maybe not this year, let me know. And it was awesome talking with you guys. Hope you enjoy the rest of Connections.